welcome to The Winning Mentality. I'm Charlie Bosco, and this is the podcast getting the stories behind sporting success. Now, my guest today has already been on the podcast once. He was our very first guest. Sports psychologist, author, and speaker Damian Hughes was episode 1, and even nowadays, whenever we get any feedback or people getting in touch about the podcast, his is one of the names that crops up over and over again as being one of people's absolute favourite episodes. By the way, if you do want to get in touch, it's contact@thewinningmentality.com. Now, I'm on Damian's email list, and an email popped up from him talking about his new book, The Barcelona Way, Unlocking the DNA of a Winning Culture. And he probably wished I wasn't on his mailing list, because I instantly emailed him back and said, that sounds really interesting. Can you come back on the podcast and give us another hour of your time to talk about it? But luckily for us, he said yes. The book, as you might have guessed in the title, is studying how FC Barcelona in the late 2000s, which led to almost unprecedented success. And it also looks at the broader questions of culture and how to create a winning culture, be that in sport, business, or just in life, in any organisation. Naturally, we talk about the book, but the conversation veered to some quite diverse topics, including why sports coaches have a problem they share with the Queen, Warren Buffett's hiring principles, Blackburn Rovers, my grandma, and plenty more. We also discussed the effect of social media on individuals and team culture. And to start the conversation, we had a quick chat about Damian's trip away. He's just got back from 3 weeks away in the US, Canada, and Argentina with the Scottish Rugby Union team, working under head coach Gregor Townsend. Before we get started, one thing I would recommend is having a notepad nearby. When I listened back to this after we'd recorded it, I found myself making a lot of notes. There's a lot of fantastic advice in here from Damian, regardless of what walk of life you're in, and there's also a good bit of humour as well. Damian's one of the best guests we've ever had on the podcast, and it's great to have him back. Enjoy. Damian, welcome back to the podcast. You've just been in Canada, the States, Argentina with the Scotland Rugby Union team. How was the trip?
Yeah, it was brilliant. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back on, Charlie. I really enjoyed our chat when we met in London in January. So had some lovely feedback from some of your listeners as well. So thank you for inviting me back on. Yeah, been away with the Scotland Rugby Union guys on the summer tour this year. So yeah, it's been really good. Gregor Townsend and the coaches selected quite a young, inexperienced squad to come with us to start finding out about some of these players. One of his comments was that he said that everybody's got potential, but eventually you have to start to prove it. So he wanted to bring a lot of guys that with really rich potential to find out more about their character, their personalities, and how they could cope under pressure. So it's been really rich, really, really informative, and really good fun as well.
And I know you don't want to give any confidential information about the team away, but what is your role when you're away with a team like Scotland Rugby Union?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to talk about it, like I say, without betraying confidences. My role is mainly to support the coaches. So my interest is in terms of about creating high-performing cultures and high-performing environments. And the most effective people at doing that are the coaches and the leaders within it. So my interest is how can I work with them and how can I support and facilitate them to put in place the ingredients for a culture to be successful and to let the players shine and perform at the best. What I also do is I'll then pick up with individual players and look very much around how they can perform at their best, whether that's and that's predominantly around the mental side of the game.
And I'm interested to hear you say that you talk. Well, it sounded like you talk more with the coaches as opposed to the players. Where do you stand? We'll talk more in depth about culture, and I want to ask you about your new book. But where do you stand? Just picking up on what you've just said on culture being player-driven or coach-driven. Where's the root of the culture for you?
I think it's both. I think it's both player and coach-driven. But what I'm really interested in is that in terms of my role, I want to get those ideas into the blood supply of a culture. So my interest is if I could stand up in front of the players and talk to them around that, I know that if I stand up in front of them, there'll be some players in the room that'll go, "Who are you? Why should I listen to you? What's this got to do with me?" Whereas, I mean, you'll still get some that will buy into it. Whereas when a coach stands up in front of those players and says the same idea, whether they agree with it or not, they'll buy into it because they want to be part of the team. They want to be selected. So like one of the conversations I'd had with Gregor originally was, take ego out of it. And I don't need to stand in front of the players. If I can work with you and those ideas get into the blood supply a lot faster, let's do it that way. So that partly answers the question in terms of the coach has to lead it. The coach has to set the example and be open to building a culture and recognise that culture can be a competitive advantage. But then what I often say to the coaches is their issue is, I mean, they've got a problem that's similar to the Queen, where the Queen assumes the world smells of fresh paint because everywhere she goes, everywhere's always had a lick of paint. And for many coaches, when they walk in the room, everyone buys into the culture when they're in the room. Everyone tries that bit harder. Everyone sort of puts a little bit of spring in their step. The issue is what happens when the coach isn't in the room. And that's where it needs to be player-led as well. You need players that buy into it, have a sense of identity with that culture, and they will either reinforce it for the good or they will just correct people when they're slightly out of line. So there's no either or, it's a both and thing. It needs to be led both by the coach and by the player.
And the young players you had on the tour sounded, when we were chatting before I started recording, sounded like you were pretty impressed with them.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what I think has really impressed me with a huge swathe of the guys from the Scotland rugby team is there's an essential decency about them and there's a humility. So I've been really impressed with them, just as, these are guys that are elite athletes, but are open to learning new ideas, are prepared to test themselves and stretch themselves. And that was very evident on the tour. So when we went to Argentina, one of Gregor's intentions was that we went through Buenos Aires and went straight to Resistencia, a town in the north of the country that isn't half as vibrant or as glamorous as Buenos Aires. So, but part of the reason was, how are these guys going to cope when they're in the middle of relatively nowhere, where they have to entertain themselves and occupy themselves? So that was a brilliant way of just testing them out and saying, how do these guys cope? And again, to repeat the point, they were really impressive set of blokes.
And do you think that generationally, current players are different to previous generations you've worked with? I'm just interested if you feel that the whole sporting landscape or the attitude of athletes has changed.
Yes and no. I mean, I think that I'm often really skeptical. When people talk about millennials or the new generation X and things like that, and I'm often skeptical because I go, we're still dealing with the same software. We're still the same people. We haven't evolved that fast in a generation. So I think essentially we all have an innate desire to fit in. We have an innate desire to want to feel that we're so that we can add some value to the team and contribute. And we want to feel safe that we can do that without feeling silly. So I think there's a lot more in common than there are differences. I think where the differences lie is just in terms of the conditioning and things like that. So for this next generation, these are guys that have grown up with smartphones that are a lot more like social media aware and things like that. But that's different, but it doesn't make them different, if that makes sense. So, for example, when we were on tour, the guys, like one of their evening activities, and again, I'm confident I'm not betraying anything here, but they were gripped by Love Island. So in the evening, a huge number of them would go and sit in the communal room and watch Love Island. Now, I didn't even know what it was. I'd never heard of it, but that's just a generational thing. No reason I should have heard of it, but they had. But what that tells you is, if you say, well, forget what they were watching, the fact that these guys all just wanted to sit together and they were having a laugh and they enjoyed each other's company, that is the bit that's common to any generation. We wouldn't feel part of something beyond it. Just what might entice us to be part of that is different.
That's nice to hear, actually, because you see all these pictures online of people that are walking to lampposts, look at their smartphones, and often you can be in a restaurant and it looks as if everyone's got their head buried in a smartphone. You don't feel that social media's had too big a detrimental effect on younger players?
No, although I've seen it interestingly where I was talking to a player, not with Scotland's, but I got a call earlier this year off a guy that he'd been called up to a particular team, and I'm going to be careful here just in terms of the detail, but he'd been called up to a particular team, and it was a real honour for him. But he'd been really quite bothered by the abuse that he'd received on social media. So people felt that he shouldn't have been called up. There was others that were better suited than him. And when he showed me his Twitter feed beneath it, he'd put something on about how proud he was to have received this particular honour. And underneath it was just people writing just really quite vile abuse to him. And he was asking me, like, how do you handle this? And I was a bit of a loss because, one, it's a generational thing that wasn't something that I was that aware of. But equally, I thought, there's no point in me saying to him, don't go on it, because he's a young boy, he's grown up online. So to say, don't do something that is part of your habitual nature wouldn't have been helpful to him. So we started looking around at just ways that he could do it. And in his case, what we'd said is, go on and enjoy the benefits of social media, because it can be really rich and vibrant, but do it under a pseudonym. So go and enjoy it where nobody else would know that you're on it, other than family and friends. But as for your official social media page, just put bland statements out there, but don't read the notifications, because the people that matter will be able to contact you personally. People that are just going to write and be abusive, the only medium they'll have is one that you won't go on and read.
Well, Bill Belichick, the legendary head coach in the New England Patriots, apparently one of his catchphrases repeats most days is "ignore the noise."
Yeah, and that's I mean, that's a brilliant phrase, but that's a phrase that applies even before social media. You know, focus on, like, control the controllables, focus on what matters to you rather than the noise, the hype, other people's opinions. So social media might just amplify that noise, but the principle of being able to focus and concentrate on the things that you can control, they're common to all of us.
Well, I mean, I'm a professional broadcaster, and so we get lots of social media feedback on my work. And my personal take on it is that it only hurts when they're right. I've often found when people just call you, I don't know, something very unpleasant, you can shrug it off. The only time it actually bothers me is when I think, yeah, they've got a point, actually. That wasn't very good.
Yeah, but then I often talk about the Dunning-Kruger law. Now, the Dunning-Kruger law is it's after a couple of economists and psychologists, but the Dunning-Kruger law says that if you're stupid, you're too stupid to know how stupid you are. So obvious examples of that is, like, in the early stages of, like, shows like X Factor, when you get people that can't sing coming on saying that they're going to be the next Whitney Houston, and you go, you don't realise just how good Whitney Houston is to realise how bad you are. So you don't see the gap because you just don't have the knowledge of singing to realise how technically brilliant Whitney Houston was. And I see it in sport where people will write and go, I could do better than that. And you go, it's the Dunning-Kruger law. You couldn't, but because you don't realise how good these guys are, you don't realise how big the gap is between where you are and they are. So I think it's a handy idea to apply it for anybody listening, that if somebody wants to give you abuse, just ask, are they falling foul of the Dunning-Kruger law? Because if it's people that do it or understand, say in your case, broadcasting, that wouldn't give you feedback and say, Charlie, that could have been better. Well, actually, that's worth listening to. But if it's just somebody sat at home writing abuse to you and saying that was shit, how valuable is that? Because they obviously don't understand how difficult broadcasting is to realise how good you make it look. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'll take the implied compliment all day long. That's brilliant.
Yeah, no, and and like, I don't understand broadcasting, but I know how hard it is. So I wouldn't dream of claiming that I had any knowledge or expertise in it. So I can appreciate that what you're doing is a skill that you've learned, and there's an art to making it look easy. So do take it as a compliment, honestly.
Well, thank you very much. And although I do reserve the right when I'm watching my beloved Blackburn Rovers to say that my grandma could have scored that one. I mean,
yeah, of course, yeah. But then also just think about if you then were to write to the guy that missed the chance and tell him how shit he was and tell him that's the Dunning-Kruger bit being applied.
to be honest, the way Blackburn are these days, my grandma probably could get a game up front, but we won't go there. Sorry, that's 13 minutes. I was only asking you how the tour went. We digress. I know you're a busy man, but you've managed to find time to write a new book, and you sent me the synopsis. It sounds fascinating. It sounds like a summary of this podcast almost. It's understanding a winning culture with the focus on Barcelona.
So, well, what I wanted to do was people talk a lot about culture and say, oh, you know, that's a good culture, that's a bad culture. And my challenge is I'm not sure people often have a shared view of, well, what is a culture? What does that look like? So I wanted to write a book that helps people understand, well, what is a culture? And then secondly, how do you harness the power of it to be a competitive advantage? Because it can be. So there's research out there that says if you get a culture right, it can be 22% more successful than a culture that hasn't had the same focus.
And this applies to business as well. This was one of the interesting things in your synopsis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of retaining staff, there's research that suggests that if you create a high-performing culture, people will resist the pay rise of up to 34% from somewhere else to stay in the right culture. So it's almost where you can get the right talent and keep the right talent by focusing on culture. So what I wanted to do was to write a book around that. Now, my publishers said, this sounds great. Can you view it through a sporting lens? Can you give us examples of it? And that suddenly narrows the field down massively into what you're looking at. So there was probably 3 examples of organisations that have deliberately gone out of their way to make culture a competitive advantage and that have had the subsequent success on it. So you're looking at probably the New Zealand rugby union team, you're looking at the New England Patriots, and then the third one in European football terms was Barcelona, that they've had a 10-year period of success where most people, like, the cycle of a successful team is normally 4 years, and they've gone beyond double what that cycle should be. So what I started doing was I was fortunate enough to get to interview some of the architects of it. So back in 2008, when they made this decision that they were going to use culture as a corporate advantage, I got to interview some of the people that were making those decisions and looked at how did they go about doing that. And that's what the book breaks down and explains how they did it, but equally how anybody could take the same principles and replicate them to their own organisation.
Well, one thing that was extraordinary was how the decision to employ Pep Guardiola had so little to do with football. You know, we always hear about the core competence of a football team is winning football matches, but Jose Mourinho was vastly successful. He apparently gave an amazing PowerPoint presentation, and they hired Guardiola seemingly with football almost as a second priority to his potential for creating culture and changing the club.
Yeah, exactly. So what they did was, after Rijkaard had won the European Cup in 2006...
This was Frank Rijkaard. He was a former Barcelona player, wasn't he, as well as a coach?
No, he never played for Barcelona, but Johan Cruyff, that was seen as the chief architect of the Barcelona way, had recommended him. So he was a Dutch player that Cruyff had at Ajax previously. But so they brought Rijkaard in as coach. They won the European Cup in 2006. And then what they felt was that he almost relaxed the standards after that. So the next 2 years, they went into quite a sharp decline. And by 2007, they'd realised that they needed a new approach. So this was when a couple of members of the board said, this is where our corporate culture can be a competitive advantage. So they pulled together a checklist of what the next coach needed to represent. And there's 9 points on the checklist, and only 2 of them relate to football. The rest of them is around culture. So what they then did was they pulled together a short list of 5 candidates. And of those 5 candidates, Mourinho's the standout, because at the time, his star was in the ascendancy. So if you want someone to win matches, you go and get Mourinho. But the other 4 coaches on the list, or the other 3 coaches, were all quite starred former players, but also had some success as a coach. And the 5th was Guardiola. Now, Guardiola had been successful as a captain of Barcelona, but in terms of coaching experience, he had 1 year's coaching experience with the Barcelona B team. So on a technical basis, he's your 5th most qualified candidate. But then when you view it through a cultural basis, he becomes the standout character that they have to appoint. So they put him in, and the response from the Barcelona public was, as you'd expect, relatively underwhelming. Because he went, this guy was a great player, but he's got no track record as a coach. But culturally, the cultural fit was almost perfect. So when they could bring him in, he could almost then role model and lead what the cultural revolution that was going to follow was. So one of his first moves that he did was when he took over, he insisted that the club remove the 3-star players that had helped them be successful in the 2 or 3 years prior to him being there. So Ronaldinho, Deco, and Samuel Eto'o. One of Guardiola's first statements at his press conference was, these 3 guys will not be part of the culture that we're going forward. So what he was really brilliant at doing was he identified 3, the phrase I use is trademark behaviours. So a culture is dependent on the behaviours that define it. Now, there's a distinction here I want to make for people that people often say, well, what about values? And you say, well, values are effective, or behaviours are effectively your values in action. But values are quite an abstract term. So people can profess to adhere to a value and never actually need to prove it. So the example I sometimes use is I'll work with leaders and they'll say, oh, everybody is equal in our organisation. And you go, that's fine, that's a great sentiment, but why do you have reserved car parking spaces for the senior leaders? So they contradict themselves with the way that they behave. Now, behaviour, you can hide behind a value, but you can't hide behind a behaviour. So Guardiola's point was, don't tell me you buy into the principles of this. I want to see the way you behave. So one of the guys I interviewed was the director of football at the time, a guy called Cheeky Begierdestein. And he gave me and it's a beautiful quote that I think sums up culture, where he said, your talent will get you into the Barcelona dressing room. So you've got to be good to get as far as there. He said, but how you behave decides if we keep you in that dressing room or not. And the 3 trademark behaviours that enable you to be a member of that dressing room are really quite elegant. The first one is humility. They say, so when you come into this environment, there's a good chance you're already going to be successful, you'll be a multimillionaire, you'll be well recognised, but you have to be humble, because if you're not humble, you can't learn and therefore you can't get better. The second behaviour they insist on is hard work. They say, you've had to invest an awful lot of hard work to get this far in your career. Don't lose sight of that hard work ethic that's going to require to maintain your place. And then the third one is you put the team first. So if there is ever a clash between what's right for you and what's right for the team, choose what's right for the team. And they say, if you maintain your talent and you adhere to these behaviours, you can now become a part of the culture that they were trying to create there. And Guardiola was seen very much as being somebody that could role model and lead that by example.
It's extraordinary foresight from the board who appointed him. I mean, it goes against almost every managerial appointment you hear about.
Yeah, exactly. But then, while it might be slightly unusual in the industry of elite sport, for example, one of the guys I was fortunate to spend some time with was a guy called Ferran Soriano, who's now the chief exec at the City Group. And he was one of the architects of this. And his point was, but that's not unusual in the business world, that you would appoint somebody not just on their ability to do the job, but on the way that they can role model behaviours. So I often talk about this with leaders when I say Warren Buffett, the investor at the Berkshire Hathaway Group, the one of the most successful investors of all time, urges that if you're going to recruit someone into a leadership role, there's 3 criteria you should apply when you view them. First of all, they've got to have the intelligence, so they've got to have the technical knowledge to know what they're talking about. The second criteria he recruits against is they've got to have the energy, so they've got to have just the enthusiasm to be able to do the job. But Buffett says if they've only got energy and intelligence, don't touch them, because they might use their intelligence for their own purposes. It's the third characteristic that he says defines whether you've got someone successful, and he talks about integrity. These are people that can behave with the integrity of the behaviours that the culture demands. So when you look at someone like Guardiola, you'd say, well, like, why would you appoint him? And you start looking at some of the stuff that he did, that this was a guy who his work ethic was just extraordinary. So when he was asking his players to work hard, he was exhibiting that very same thing. So there's a lovely story about him, and this is subsequent to him taking the job. But when he took over, he accepted a contract from a Catalan bank to do a series of leadership talks and masterclasses to their executive teams. And he received quite a healthy sum of money to do it. And he attracted a lot of criticism because people said, it's greedy, or it was vain what he was doing. What Guardiola never told anybody, but did this internally, was the fee that he received for doing these talks, he distributed it to all his backroom team. So he didn't take a penny himself, but he gave it to like the cleaners, the masseurs, the canteen staff, the kit man, and he made sure that he was taking care of them as a thank you for the support that they gave him.
And that's integrity.
Well, that's integrity, because that's a guy if you've said you put the team above your own self-interest, that's somebody actually demonstrating it in very clear, tangible behaviours, not just saying it. This is a guy putting that first and foremost in terms of what he does. So as a player, if this is a guy making demands of you in terms of what he expects, you're sat there thinking, I trust you because you're behaving with integrity to do it yourself as well.
Well, that actually ties in. It's I digress slightly, but I heard a fantastic interview with Warren Buffett talking about something along these lines, and he started a campaign where every billionaire in America would give half their money away.
Wow.
And he approached every billionaire, and he said a lot of them said no, and it gave him an idea for a new book called How to Survive on $500 Million.
Brilliant.
There's a bestseller to be had there.
But again, it's a really powerful point that he's making, that we get caught up in this cult of leadership. Like, you look at these billionaires and we afford genius or wisdom to them because they've been successful in one part of their life. And this is one of the things that I cover in the book when we talk about the leadership aspect, that the research there's a couple of guys that did this research. One of them is Simon Cooper. The other one is a Dutch economist, and his name doesn't come to mind at the moment. But they studied the impact of what a leader has on a team. So they looked at it from a football lens, but it applies outside of that as well. And what they found is that the role of a head coach, or a leader in this case, the most impact that they will have on a team's performance is 10%. So when you view that, that should almost force us, if you're a head coach or a leader in that regard, to actually display a bit of humility. So, because the point they make is they're the most powerful individual, but they're not going to make or break a team. So the metaphor they use is it's almost like the prime minister of a country. They're the most powerful individuals. So if Theresa May came out and criticised the markets or the economy, it would have an impact, but it wouldn't make or break it. So from a leader's point of view, the question should be that don't get caught up in the cult that you're the most powerful person there and that you can make a team uber successful. So you see, like in the Fortune 500 companies, where I think the stat now is that the chief exec of an organization like that gets paid something like 250 times the salary of an average employee. And you go, that's ridiculous, because they're not 250 times more powerful than these guys. So it forces humility, and what it forces coaches to ask the question is, how do you maximize your 10%? Because you're only going to get the chance to influence it by 10%. So focus on the bits where you can achieve the maximum impact.
Well, with the clown in the White House right now, I'm glad he can't make too much of a difference.
Yeah, but again, it's a really good example where we get caught up in the cult of that individual. So we get caught up in the cult of how powerful they are, and it feeds into this narrative that leaders are this cult of leadership. When the reality is, in a successful culture, they're important and they're the most important person, but they're not the dominant character. Because if you allow that to happen, what you create there is a culture of autocracy that is dependent on the whims. It's almost like a Roman, in the sort of Roman Empire times. It becomes driven by the whims of one individual.
Well, one thing that really came across, I mean, obviously, I've only read the synopsis of the book, is how it wasn't about one individual and the players bought in. And I heard, after I read the synopsis, I was so interested, I did some research, and there was a brilliant quote from Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and he said, none of the lads, the players, acted like superstars, which was strange. Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, the whole gang, they were schoolboys. The best footballers in the world stood there with their heads bowed, and I didn't understand it. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, right. Now, I've done a chapter of this in the book on Zlatan, because he's a guy that he was their record signing at the time. So they bought him from Inter Milan for 70 million euros, and they sold him for 40 million euros 10 months later. So you go, this is really interesting then. So somebody's come into a culture and been rejected from it. What happened? Because there's no arguing that of someone like Ibrahimovic's talent. But when you view it through the cultural lens, it becomes obvious why he didn't fit. So in his own words, so that quote that you gave there just betrays just a little hint of it. So there's some brilliant stories that he tells, and he tells them as if he's in the right rather than viewing it through the culture. So if you take the example of humility, one of the things that he talks about on his first day at training, he turned up and Guardiola comes and gives him the keys to a club Audi. And he says to him, listen, drive your Audi into training. One of our behaviours is humility. So we don't drive Ferraris or Lamborghinis or any fancy sports cars into training. That's not what we're about. You got the keys to a club car, drive your club car into training. And he agrees to that and he complies with it for 4 months. And then he gets dropped for a game against Almuera and he's unhappy that he's been dropped. So he says, who are they to tell me what car I should drive in? So in his own words, he says, I drove my Enzo car into training. It attracted a whole heap of unwelcome press where the papers ran a story saying that my car was worth more than the Almuera players' monthly wages. And he says, I didn't give a shit. I was trying to make a point that they couldn't tell me what to do. But if you look at that through humility, you go, this isn't a guy subscribing to the behaviours that the culture demands. When they play another team, they ask him to play a different position because they've got injuries. And he goes to Guardiola and says, listen, he said, I'm like a Ferrari. You're driving me like I'm a Fiat. If you don't want to play me where I'm best, don't pick me. This isn't a guy putting the team above his own self-interest. So when you start to see examples where he's not subscribing to it, there's a really interesting effect that when you make culture so powerful, the effect I talk about is the FIFO effect kicks in. Now, the FIFO effect is you either fit in or fuck off. But you can't be half in. You can't say, well, I like some bits and don't like others. No, you either fit in completely or you go somewhere else. Go to a different culture where your talent or your nature will be more widely recognised. And that became very evident there at Barcelona, that the point about Ibrahimovic was, we don't flex this culture, however talented an individual might be.
But, I mean, well, we could sit here all day psychoanalyzing Zlatan Ibrahimovic.
Yeah.
Everyone's got a favourite Zlatan story. My favourite was when apparently he got offered a trial at Arsenal when he was 17 and he said Zlatan doesn't do auditions.
Brilliant. And that's great. And like, I spoke to some of the players about him, and what every one of them was at pains to talk about was said, he's a great bloke, really good bloke, really talented. So nobody spoke ill of him as a person or even as a talent. But what they were at pains to point out was, it just didn't work for us. Our culture was driven by those three behaviours, and we just weren't the right culture for him. But that's a powerful thing to recognise, that you don't have to be all things to all people. You can stand for something really powerful for culture. And it's just as powerful for people to say, this isn't the right place for me. And that's fine as well.
But I think what's so fascinating about it is the level of buy-in he got from. I mean, you could certainly argue that for a few years, Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta were the three best players in the world, and he got buy-in from all of them, the whole squad. How do you go about getting that buy-in? I mean, do you incentivize people? Do you just say, look, if you just buy in, we're going to win? Or is there a deeper way of getting people to buy in?
Well, first of all, that you have to be able to convince people that these ways are going to work. So one of the phrases that I often encourage people to do if they're interested in looking at culture is start with the principle that success leaves clues. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the point is that when you're successful, often we celebrate, we go, we enjoy the period of success, then we move on. My challenge is success leaves clues. So go and analyse, why are you successful? What makes you successful? How did you behave when you were successful? And go and deconstruct the DNA of what that success looks like in behavioural terms. Because that becomes really powerful when things go wrong as well. Because when you have a setback or things are difficult times, part of elite sport is managing that down period. There will always be periods where things go wrong. So how do you make the gap between your best and worst times as narrow as possible? And the way you do that is understanding around behaviours. So Guardiola wasn't coming up. So those two behaviours of humility, hard work and putting the team first were behaviours that Johan Cruyff had helped to establish when he came both as a player in the 70s and when he returned in the early 90s. So when you're conveying that to the likes of Messi, Iniesta, Xavi, you're not telling them something that isn't proven. You're saying this works and we've got evidence of it. We've got clues that it works. So you're showing them. So naturally, their buy-in tends to be a lot quicker. You're not pointing out what they're not good at. You're pointing out when they are good, what does that look like? And that's often the first step of getting that buy-in.
Well, the last sentence of your synopsis, and maybe the book itself, I don't know, is brilliant. All cultural change has something in common. For anything to change, someone has to start acting differently.
Yeah, very much. So the question is, how do you do that? And it's about defining the behaviours, the trademark behaviours that are unique to your own team, your own culture, your own organisation, and then really reinforcing them, rewarding them, recruiting people against them, promoting people against them, celebrating them, all of that. So the behaviours is almost the key point that everything else will spring from.
And I'm not sure if by asking this question I'm missing the point slightly, but one thing that's really nice from what I've seen of the book is we mentioned humility earlier, and you say cultures aren't universal. Don't expect that I'm just going to give you an answer and it's going to fit every organisation. There's exceptions and different cultures and organisations work differently. But for people listening to this, they might think, yeah, okay, that's great, work for Guardiola. Can you pinpoint certain behaviours that people, whether they're leading an organisation or just part of it, can exhibit, which will lead to cultural change, albeit maybe small or slow?
Yeah, but I'll answer that in two ways, Charlie, if I can. So the first thing to understand is that what I'm describing here is one very specific type of culture. So the first thing I would encourage people, if they're listening, thinking, how do I do some of this within my own world, that might be very different from this, or you don't have a Guardiola figure for it, is first of all, work out what type of culture is there. So traditionally there are 5 types of culture. Now, they can all work in their own way. So if I can just explain them briefly. The first type of culture you get is like a superstar culture. So in football terms, think of somewhere like Real Madrid, where they've got a very deliberate policy of go and recruit the world's best talent, pay them the most amount of money, give them fantastic facilities, and when that talent comes together and works, it'll be spectacular, like they're experiencing now. But when it goes wrong, it'll be spectacularly bad as well, which was what happened when they went through their longest trophyless period, adopting this policy in the mid-2000s. The second type of culture you can get is an autocracy. And an autocracy tends to be dominated by one powerful individual, whether that's a head coach or the founder or somebody like that. So probably a really good example. Well, there's two good examples. If you look at Chelsea under Roman Abramovich, he hires and fires managers at his own whim. Or you look somewhere like Manchester United, where I think there was a really interesting change in culture at Manchester United under Ferguson. So Ferguson was getting people to buy into about the club and the values. But then if you pay close attention, he changes what he says about 7 years before he retires. And one of his comments used to be, nobody's bigger than the club. And then if you notice, there's a period where he starts to change it subtly to say, nobody is bigger than the manager of the club. So in his book that he writes about leading, he talks about that nobody's bigger than the manager. And I think what you see at United is you remove that charismatic, powerful figure like him away from the culture. The vacuum that exists creates confusion and uncertainty, which is what the club are going through now. The third type of culture you can get is a bureaucracy. And this is where it's run by policies, procedures, rules and regulations. So somewhere like Liverpool is a really good example of this, where they appointed a transfer committee. So they worked on the Billy Bean Moneyball principle of, actually, if you look at the stats and facts and figures, you can make some really smart decisions. Now, Brendan Rodgers, when he was there, spoke about this was a big frustration to him because he felt that sometimes they were focused on the business side of it and the statistical side of it too much, rather than the outcome side of it and the culture. The fourth way, is an engineering culture. And this is where you bring in technically brilliant players to do technically brilliant jobs. And you hope that if every one of them does that, they will come together as a cohesive team. So again, probably a really pertinent example there is somewhere like Arsenal under the last years of Wenger, where he was bringing in some technically exquisite players, but they somehow were less than the sum of their parts. The culture I'm describing here, though, when we talk about Barcelona and what Guardiola did, was he developed what we call a commitment culture. And a commitment culture is where you say, you know what, we're just custodians of this, but the behaviours and what we stand for will outlast any of us. So you get people to buy in to the whole purpose, the whole behavioural contract of the organisation, and say, if you can buy into this, this will outlast us for far longer. So part of the reason they've sustained this 10-year success, Guardiola left, they brought in Villanova, then they brought Martino, then they brought Enrique in, now they brought Van der Velde in, and the success is maintained because the success leaves clues. The behaviours and their purpose of what they stand for has been maintained long after any particular individual has moved on. So that's the point that it's a long-winded answer to the question, but if I was a listener thinking, what can I do here? First of all, identify the type of culture that you want. Now, interestingly, if you need an incentive for it, there was a study done in Silicon Valley on this that suggested that cultures that go down the commitment route tend to be, on average, about 22% more profitable and successful than the other four. So there's an incentive to say, go down this route, but it's a slightly harder route. The second bit of answering the question then is, this will be like, so what are the common behaviours that all successful cultures have? Well, that's the bit that becomes a little bit more specific to each organisation, that where the success leaves clues mantra becomes more prevalent. But I would say the first thing that has to be there is an openness. And whether you describe that as humility or otherwise, it's just openness to being prepared to be challenged and do things in a slightly different way. I think if that's not there, people will defend and resist and almost entrench their own position rather than being prepared to be open to see whether there is an alternative to it. And then the second quality is courage, because it takes balls to do this. Because it takes balls to say, you know what, the culture can be a competitive advantage, because it's easier to believe that it's just about technical skills or getting the right players in. And they're important, I'm not discounting that. But it takes courage to be prepared to go at it from a slightly different angle, because if it goes wrong, it's easier to criticise.
Yeah, I think listening to that, I certainly feel that I'm not always showing those characteristics. And I don't think many people listening will be able to look in the mirror and honestly say they do those things. So that's a pretty solid place to start.
Yeah, but again, what I'd say, and this applies to your comment there about yourself, Charlie. It applies to me. It applies to anyone listening. This, I often think, just be kind to ourselves with this, because what I see when I go into these high performing cultures is people are really well intentioned. People really want to do the right thing. Do we make mistakes occasionally? Do we fall? Do we get things wrong? Yeah, of course we do. And that's fine. But I think when we're kind to ourselves and go, you know what, my intention was right, maybe my execution wasn't, that's what gives us the ability to go back and have another go. So, like, this is a slight aside, but sometimes I'll get called in to work with teams where they say, oh, we need to be more resilient. And the first thing I say is, stop being a dick then. Stop behaving like dicks. Because nobody needs to be resilient in the face of kindness. Nobody needs to be resilient when people are well-intentioned and want you to do well. Resilience is often only required when you're in a culture where that kind of dickhead behaviour is allowed to flourish and prosper. So I think we can apply that both to culturally and to ourselves to say, just be kind to ourselves. We don't need to beat ourselves up.
That's a lovely piece of advice. Damian, it's been a fascinating 45 minutes, and just reading the summary of your book got me all fired up on researching various bits of Barcelona, and I'm really looking forward to it coming out. When and where can people get a copy?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for your enthusiasm, and I am grateful. One of the big things I've learned about writing books is that often it's just about trying to infuse people and get people to be aware of it. So I'm grateful for you being willing to invite me on and have a chat about it. The book officially comes out on the 9th of August. So it's out on the 9th of August, and then it'll be available from the places like Amazon and all the big bookstores and things like that. But then again, if people want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to sort of direct them to places where they can find out a little bit more about it. So I'm on Twitter, Liquid Thinker, or my email address is Damian@liquidthinker.com, and I'm happy to sort of pick up any questions that people might have and give them more information if they want to find out more and apply this, because a big driver for me is about helping people to create these kind of cultures where other people can go and shine and flourish and be at the very best. And a big intention behind the book is to give people the tools to understand how they can go and do that themselves.
Well, I suppose, like the famous Martin Luther King quote that wrong being done to one person is wrong being done to everyone. I suppose if you can make the people that read your book better, that's good for everyone. It's good for the world.
Yeah, it is, and like writing books is a strange thing because you write it and sort of like I've been immersed in this for about 3 years, and so I feel really protective. I'm really proud of it and things like that, and then it's born and it goes out into the world, and you often don't know how is it being received. How are people what are people doing with this? How are they taking it? And like I'm lucky some people come back and give you feedback on it or want to ask questions, but again, I'm really open to it just because the intention is genuinely to see people flourish and create cultures where others can do that. So again, if I can help people, whether it's colouring in more detail for them or just simply chatting with them about it, I'm more than happy to do that because like you say, we all win when we do that because the world just becomes a better place.
Damian, when people come up to me and say they've been enjoying the podcast, and this is no slur on the other guests, your name is the one that crops up most when people name specific episodes. So I don't think you will struggle for positive feedback, but it'll be interesting to hear what people do ask you, and very generous of you to offer to answer the questions, and very generous of you to give me another hour of your time today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on, Charlie, and thank you to the listeners for making the time to just tune in and listen. Thank you.
Thank you again to Damian for his time. The book, The Barcelona Way, Unlocking the DNA of a Winning Culture, is out in August. Make sure you get a copy. You can also check out Damian at www.liquidthinker.com or on Twitter at liquidthinker. Thank you for listening.